All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Courtney Flint, a faculty in the Department of Environment and Society, and I'm very pleased to be introducing our speaker for today's QCNR speaker series. Dr. Mariya Shcheglovitova joined the ENVS faculty in fall of 2020, coming to us after completing her PhD in geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She's an urban political ecologist with research interests in environmental justice, housing, human nature interactions, queer ecology, waste, and counter mapping. As a PhD student, she was a National Science Foundation graduate research fellow and conducted her research on urban forests and housing justice issues in Baltimore. And today she's going to talk a little bit about and share some of her research that she's developing in Southeastern Utah. And so with no further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Shcheglovitova. And thanks all for being here.
All right. Thanks so much, Courtney. And I just turned on my Zoom mic, so if folks on Zoom can't hear me, just let me know. And so like Courtney said, I'm Mariya Shcheglovitova. Mariya is just fine. You don't have to struggle through my last name. I use the pronouns she, her, and this is my second year at USU, and it's been a weird time. I've been very pleased to get to know many of you, but it's wonderful to see new faces in the room, and I hope that we all can meet each other. So I'm going to talk about some preliminary research that I have gotten started doing in Southeastern Utah, and this research kind of grew out of trips down to Moab to stay sane during COVID-19. And during these trips, I started getting familiar both with the desert landscape alongside Cold War infrastructure, which was kind of personal and moving for me because I was born in the Soviet Union, and so just thinking about these juxtapositions together. So the photo here is from the Green River Launch Complex, which is off of the I-70 outside of Green River, Utah. And so this is one of many Cold War nuclear weapons test sites, which operated between the 1960s and 1970s. And I just wanted to start with this image because it shows this juxtaposition of the dangerous, toxic legacies along with beautiful desert scenery. So my academic thinking about this work on waste in the desert started with a provocation that came from a reviewer comment on a paper based on my dissertation research. And I'll just talk about what that research was on very briefly to orient you to it. So the paper was about a program in Baltimore, Maryland, where wood was being harvested from vacant and abandoned homes to reuse and sell as recycled furniture and wall cladding. And you can see the process here being carried out by a worker removing floorboards from a house. And what the reviewer observed was that the paper was about tensions between waste and value, but really overly focused on the materiality of waste. And they wrote that the concept of value itself remains black boxed. And they asked this great question, what is value after all? And so I'm not going to talk about this paper, but instead I'm going to talk about how this provocation of what is value has shaped my thinking about some work in progress in Utah. So I'll start by giving a brief overview of literature on geographies of waste and value, and I'll focus specifically on how this literature engages with race. I'll then give a brief overview of methods focusing mainly on the use of critical discourse analysis, and then I'll get into this in-process, very preliminary case study, which I'm calling Constructing the Toxic or Secure Desert, which is a throwback to the deconstruction of homes in Baltimore. And then I was reluctant to end with conclusions, so I'll just end by doing some thinking through of the connections and disconnections that I'm seeing in this work. So a good place to start when thinking about geographies of waste is this paper by Sarah Moore, where she's really concerned with this rematerialization in geography, inspired by Jane Bennett's work on vibrant matter. She says, like, geographers really need to pay attention to the stuff, the materiality of waste. And paying attention to waste as a material can help us understand it as a commodity, or what she says, something that has yet to be ascribed value. And Sarah Moore gets geographers to really start thinking about waste as a useful concept because, as she defines it, waste is a parallax object, something that makes humans take notice by disturbing the smooth running of things. And as work has kind of grown on waste in geography, it's really talking about waste as something that's always in relation to value. So whether it's a material that has yet to be ascribed value or a space that has been devalued in these cycles of devaluation and valuation so that it can become a new frontier of accumulation. And we see this in urban geography research on gentrification and also on research on resource frontiers of extraction. And the production of waste and value is intertwined with the production of racial difference. And we see this in work and thinking in geography. And there's an abundant example of this in urban settings. I want to just draw attention to one notable example from Lindsay Dillon's work on the Hunters Point shipyard in San Francisco, where she writes about how the majority Black neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point was polluted by hazardous waste accumulated through a century of industrial shipbuilding and repair. And then also the discarded end products of a radiologic laboratory that operated on that same location, only to become targeted for urban development projects that aimed to revitalize the city's waterfront and displaced the residents that had lived there, accumulating years of pollution. And so having worked in cities like Baltimore, which is a majority Black and heavily segregated city, this is a process that I have become particularly attuned to in my own research. But there are parallels in other locations. So similar to urban scholars of waste and value, Tracy Bryan Voles directs understandings of waste and value in the desert to be necessarily viewed through a lens of racialization and colonization. Voles writes about uranium mining in Navajo country to develop the concept of wastelanding, a process by which the discourses of barren wastelands are entwined with racialized spaces, rendering the lands themselves and the bodies that inhabit them pollutable. And so Voles argues that wastelanding materializes or makes real the discourse of the desert being a barren, vacant place. And it does this through acts of environmental extraction and pollution. So what I'm really interested in is this relational production of waste and value and how these relationships rely on the production of racial hierarchies that render land and bodies pollutable. But I'm also interested in what ruptures in these relationships might look like. So for instance, are there wastes and wastelands that defy valuation? And how might these defiances be articulated as contradictions, resistances, and possibilities? And these possibilities, Sarah Kunth, Shiana Potts, and Jenny Coltstein remind us, can have an ability to threaten capitalism's ability to reproduce itself. So some brief notes on methods for now. So the research that I do is based on ethnographic fieldwork, and the data that I work with falls within this broad category of discourse. So that's written or spoken text, images, material artifacts, symbols, landscapes, social processes, all of these things. And I analyze these data using critical discourse analysis, which grows out of the analytical tradition of Michel Foucault, who sought to understand the production of knowledge as an effect of power that, importantly for this work, is historically situated. And so I'm not only interested how present day discourses help us understand this production of wastelands and valuable landscapes, but I'm also interested in how these discourses are located in the past and how the past use of those discourses stretches into the present. And I just want to make a note that ethnography and discourse analysis are not straightforward or linear methodologies. They require this cyclical return to texts, both data sets and academic texts. And through this cyclical iterative process, you build layers of meaning and understanding. So in the spirit of this messy methodology, I want to talk to you about an in-process case study, which I am very much not done thinking about. And while I'm interested in all sorts of wastes in the desert, from fecal waste to art out of place, I'm going to talk about a specific example today, which is the example of nuclear waste. I'm gonna take my jacket off, but I can do it because I had the mic on. All right. So this is the Moab Mill. It's a former uranium mill located 3 miles outside of Moab, Utah. The original mill site was constructed in 1956 by the Uranium Reduction Company. In 1962, the mill was sold to Atlas Minerals. So this was just a changing of hands. They continued to process ore at the site, and processing ore at the site carried on until 1984. The mill remained closed until Atlas filed for bankruptcy in 1988, and the site ownership transferred to the Department of Energy, who in 2001 started doing work to remediate the site. So the DOE is responsible for site cleanup and reclamation under Title I of the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act. And site cleanup involves transporting all of the contaminated materials by train from the Moab site to a disposal cell in Crescent Junction, which is located approximately 40 miles north of Moab at the intersection of I-70 and the 191. The construction of an offsite cell for tailings disposal was not a neutral decision. And so this decision was made through a drawn out environmental assessment process, which considered the benefits and detriments of leaving tailings at the Moab site and several sites for relocation. And so I'll talk about kind of how this process came about, this decision to move the mill tailings. And I'll build that narrative by drawing on planning documents, archival materials, and some background interviews. And through this research, I join a bunch of critical scholars, just a few of them whose work is displayed down there. And the goal of this research is examining nuclear remains in a way that deconstructs the seemingly neutral technological discourse of cleaning up nuclear waste. The DOE's initial plan for the mill tailings was on-site disposal. In the environmental impact statement, they reported on feedback for site plans in which, quote, commentators stated that the pile should remain in place because Moab had the benefits of the mill and should bear the burdens, and because moving the pile would only cause additional environmental damage elsewhere. But unlike other nearby sites where remediation proceeded through on-site disposal, and those sites include Monticello and Green River, opposition to capping the tailings in place in Moab was driven by very local specificities, including impacts to the Colorado River and the site's proximity to Arches National Park. If you've been in Arches and you look south from some points in the park, you can see the mine tailings in the distance. 3 sites were considered for tailings disposal. And the feasibility of disposal at these sites was justified relative to the land being undeveloped, wasted, and in some cases already contaminated. I want to use this map to orient you to Moab, although I might not need to do that for most of you here. I don't know if I can actually see that, but Moab is just down there. And I'll plot the proposed disposal sites on the map as well. Klondike Flats, one of the considered sites and a popular mountain biking location, was described as undeveloped land near the Grand County landfill in the environmental impact statement. White Mesa was selected as a potential disposal site because it is the only operating uranium mill in the US, but the site was highly contested due to its known harms to communities living in the town of White Mesa and on Ute Nation sovereign lands. Crescent Junction, the site that was ultimately selected for mill tailings disposal, was simply described in DOE documents as undeveloped land. DOE documents presented the disposal cell as a hindrance to development in Moab and Crescent Junction as a location that can absorb the ability not to develop, although as I'll talk about, that is contested. In the remainder of the talk, I'll explore how the DOE argued for the relocation of mill tailings from Moab and the implications of remediating toxic waste for valuing land in Moab and also in Crescent Junction and the surrounding area. Moab is an outdoor recreation mecca located near Arches and Canyonlands National Parks. During the uranium boom years of the 40s and 50s, Moab was the location of some of the largest uranium strikes in the Colorado Plateau. This history is nostalgically woven into the town's fabric. There's still a sign reading uranium offices on the facade of a building which now houses the Redstone T-shirt company gift shop. And driving through town, you are welcome to grab a bite at the Atomic Grill and Lounge or cut your hair at the Atomic Salon. In a section titled Aesthetics and the Local Economy in the environmental impact statement, DOE authors explained that, quote, the pile should be relocated because it is unattractive and discourages tourism in the Moab area. The on-site disposal alternative would likely have unavoidable adverse impacts on visual resources. From key observational points, the predominantly smooth horizontal lines created by an on-site disposal cell would continue to produce a strong to moderate contrast with the adjacent sandstone cliffs. And this image, that top image, shows a DOE simulation of what that on-site disposal cell might look like. And as a contrast, the bottom image is a current Google Street View from approximately the same location with the tailings pile, I think roughly over there. The positioning of Moab as valuable terrain with an expected aesthetics interwoven into the local economy relies on the presence of specific people to traverse and view the terrain. Despite a proud display of businesses hinting at radioactivity, the town of Moab could not afford to have a constant reminder of the material dangers, uncertainties, and harms of nuclear waste, spoil, recreation, tourist, and locals' views of sandstone cliffs. And also, I'll get to later, they couldn't have this pile threaten the groundwater and the Colorado River. Valerie Kulitz argues that an understanding of deserts as barren predisposes them to deterritorialization, or the construction of particular lands as sacrifice zones. Deterritorialization, Kulitz suggests, is why the deserts of the American Southwest are littered with the remains of environmentally destructive extractive industries. Moab, however, provides an example of the fluidity of some desert lands sacrificed to extraction. Here, the presence of a profitable outdoor tourism industry and a wealthy white community makes wasting terrain presently unacceptable, effectively re-territorializing the Moab desert as valuable. The DOE explicitly frames the Moab site as valuable terrain when they write, quote, we recognize the strategic location and potential value of the Moab site real estate. But they state this cautiously, also saying that they believe that exercising caution is preferable to speculating on future land uses. The land area required for groundwater remediation, which could exceed 40 acres, would be unavailable for an estimated 75 years. The 2018 Community Vision Plan for After the Pile further stresses the unlikelihood of real estate development at the Moab site. In this case, they explicitly address housing, writing that while affordable housing is a concern, the 2018 update, like the 2013 initial community vision, does not provide for residential use at the site. And they say that this is due to the potential health issues with long-term occupancy at the site of a former uranium mill and potential for flooding above the 100-year floodplain. And these relationships to value of the mill tailing site to real estate need to be read in the context of what the executive director of the Southeastern Utah Housing Authority has framed as a housing crisis that has shifted from the need for low income housing to an essential workers' housing crisis. This also raises the question of who the value at the mill site is being produced for. Plans for the mill site include what the site's future committee has called a mega gateway that would serve as a site welcoming visitors to Moab. The proposal for this gateway includes a transit center, bike and pedestrian trails, and potentially its own wastewater treatment site because city sewer services aren't available on the north side of the Colorado River. And what I want to focus on is the proposed naming of this park. A celebratory relationship to mining continues to be written into Moab's terrain with the proposition that the remediated mill site should contain a park named Prospector Community Park. And I read this as a tension because prospecting takes us back to the historical intent to extract value from America's wastelands. I want to briefly historicize this idea of the prospector in Moab and talk about how it's animated the town's relationship with value. In May 1955, the Lions Club of Moab hosted the annual Uranium Capital Rodeo. This event opened with a parade which featured town members such as Bob Wilson dressed as prospectors, who this caption describes as, quote, going afoot into the rugged country to bring out the precious ores. Tracy Bryan Bowles describes the prospector as the embodiment of American masculinity engaged in a deeply American economic venture to strike it rich in the virgin lands of America's new frontier. She argues that this Western white imaginary was further supported by the conflation of uranium with national defense, positioning the prospector as a Cold War warrior protecting America's influence abroad. In Moab, this militarized savior narrative positioned uranium mining as something to be celebrated at events like the Uranium Rodeo, and now with the proposed naming of Prospector Community Park. The fervor of prospecting radiated out of Moab, touching sites like Crescent Junction, where the mill tailings are now being buried. And you can see an aerial image of the disposal cell in Crescent Junction here, surrounded by the Book Cliffs. And this Times Independent article from 1955 describes the rush of staking claims in the surrounding area during the time of the uranium boom in Moab, as seeing a flurry of staking similar to the days of the Gold Rush. So effectively, Moab cast the shadow of value on the land, which led people to make these claims, radiating out from Moab to the surrounding area. And the uranium boom also brought businesses to surrounding towns like Thompson Springs. As one white male town resident who was born in 1953 and describes himself as not only a baby boomer, but also a uranium boomer. So he explained that the Desert Moon had been in business in Thompson Springs since the 1930s. And he talked about how various businesses along this old highway have fared really well. And he attributes this in part to the railroad, but also speaks to the importance of the uranium boom for this town. So the Desert Moon is an inn and former bar, and you can see a historical image on the left there. And also it was recently within the last year bought and reopened in the town of Thompson Springs, which I'll talk about why this revitalization is important here. U-238 is the most common radioactive element in tailings that are being buried in disposal cells. And I'll explain why this is connected. And while mill tailings are classified by the DOE as low-level wastes, U-238 has a half-life of 4.47 billion years. I bring this up because as a material with an incomprehensibly long life, radiation necessarily evokes connections between the past and the present. As the uranium boom brought interest not only to Moab, but to surrounding areas like Crescent Junction and Thompson Springs, the housing demand in and around Moab is similarly bringing interest to prospecting land outside the city. Today, Thompson Springs is an unincorporated town with a 2020 census population estimate of 34 people. Thompson Springs is located about 40 miles north of Moab, but also importantly, it's located about 6 miles west of Crescent Junction, where the disposal cell is located. And Thompson Springs is close enough to Crescent Junction that the DOE maintains an air monitoring station in town. And so the site's proximity to radioactive waste is very materially acknowledged by the DOE. But this is also related to housing. And as a commentator at a recent Grand County Planning Commission meeting expressed, quote, "There's been increased interest in Thompson Springs as a bedroom community for Moab." And I won't read the rest of that. So I did some background interviews with folks in Thompson Springs about a month ago. And in all of my attempts to talk about the disposal cell, I was repeatedly told that it's not about the cell. It's about development and water here. And views generally aligned with what was expressed at the June 10th, 2021 Grand County Planning Commission meeting by Marls Olrod, and this is from the public record of that meeting. Marls expressed that she is not anti-growth, but residents of Thompson Springs may not be interested in being a bedroom community for Moab. She has concerns about water availability and concerns about rezoning and property taxes. And there's a lot to unpack here, but for now, I want to focus on water. And I'm focusing on water because it helps make connections to the disposal cell, which was placed in Crescent Junction precisely because of the lack of water. The Crescent Junction site was identified as the preferred offsite disposal location because it has the longest isolation period. That's the time in which contaminants could reach the groundwater. And this is important because all disposal cells seep to some extent, but the degree to which seepage is to the degree to which they seep is partially determined by the moisture content of the land where the cell is constructed. So the drier the area, the longer U-238 will take to reach the groundwater. The lack of water in Thompson Springs and Crescent Junction is animated as a compelling imaginary that makes Thompson Springs safe from seeping toxic waste into groundwater and reassimilation into Moab's growth through development. And so the struggle in Thompson Springs becomes not one against waste, but against value, in an attempt to prove the infeasibility of becoming a bedroom community for Moab, because the land is just too arid to be valuable for development. And after all, as I was told, the struggle against waste has always already been ongoing elsewhere. As a white male Thompson Spring resident tells me when I ask about whether the disposal cell in Crescent Junction presents any concerns for the town, no, he says, the problems are about water and development here. The uranium problem is in White Mesa. And if you recall, White Mesa is where the last operating uranium mill in the US is located. So with this claim, this resident evokes the logics of wastelanding, recovering Thompson Springs from associations with waste because the wasteland is elsewhere, specifically in White Mesa. And in this way, the residents' discourse evokes an environmental privilege that depends on racial and spatial hierarchies, because of course, White Mesa pollutes Ute Mountain Ute lands and is part of a complex of toxicity permeating Navajo Nation and the Four Corners area. And although Thompson Springs is physically proximate to a disposal cell containing material waste, the town's identity is shaped by the shadow of Moab's value and the wastelanding of White Mesa. And so I'm going to try and connect some of the threads here and maybe end with some open questions. So I started by evoking Sarah Moore's definition of waste as a parallax object or something that disturbs the smooth running of things. But the mill tailings themselves do not seem to disturb the smooth running of things in Moab. Despite concerns expressed by the DOE that the tailings might deter tourism, tourism in Moab has been growing, with some sources reporting that the spring of 2021 was the busiest season on record for parks and businesses. And this uninterrupted profitability can be tracked to the uranium boom, which has been used to promote tourism in Moab since events like the Uranium Rodeo, and now with the naming of Prospector Park. In these ways, Moab's history has been shaped by value from uranium to tourism. And the search for value then can be viewed in Moab as a parallax object in parallel to waste, because value has, the search for value has catalyzed the extractive process of removing ore from the ground and also seeking frontiers for real estate development to create frictions in the land in and around Moab. The uncertainty of contamination and flooding permeate the land at the Moab mill site, and these uncertainties have been used to argue that the site will be unsafe for permanent housing. Instead, the remediated mill site will become a mega gateway that welcomes tourists to Moab. And the contradiction here is the reliance of both the mill site remediation and the tourist industry on laboring bodies who lack places to live. So while remediation is supported at the Moab site by DOE discourses evoking the value of Moab real estate, waste and labor are externalized from Moab through discussions about land speculation for building worker housing focused on Thompson Springs, which is, again, located just 6 miles away from Crescent Junction. And while the disposal of mill tailings in Crescent Junction represents a more equitable distribution of Cold War waste infrastructure to localities that had the benefits of the uranium boom, these localities are not enrolled in the discursive production of wastelands, which remain spatially focused on land in White Mesa. And so I want to come back to this question of how the degraded and devalued defy strategic reassimilation, and how new sources and forms of devaluation ultimately threaten capitalism's ability to reproduce itself. And I think the desert as a space that is discursively and materially, but unevenly produced as a wasteland is a productive place to think about this. And the open questions that I'm kind of starting to wonder about and sit with is how local and particular stories of relationships to waste and value, like those in Thompson Springs and Moab, can help shed light on how settler colonial and white imaginaries have not only produced the desert as a wasteland, but simultaneously and necessarily produced the desert as valuable land. And I also wonder about how the matter of the desert, the land and the water, or the lack of water, are vital actants in defying this valuation, because the matter of the desert itself, in a way, is what has also been devalued alongside the people who live there. So that is kind of all I've thought through to share with you. And so thank you for taking this journey with me. And I would be glad to talk about any lingering thoughts or questions.
Great, thank you. Very thought-provoking. So I'll run around with the microphone and then you can kind of handle the questions. So do we have questions in the room? I hope so. We can get some lively discussion going here. We have some time. Don't be shy.
I've got the Zoom chat open too.
Do you have any information on how the economic benefits from mining, like who that has benefited, and then who has been the primary receiver of the consequences of mining, such as water pollution and health crisis, cancer rates, etc.?
Nationally, or okay. I haven't kind of traced the economics of it, but I do know in terms of the disposal cell, the people who are employed there, only 2 of them live in Thompson Springs, and hardly any of the folks live in Moab. And so I don't know if that kind of helps provide context, and kind of the environmental damage is widespread because it's a material that is not only taken out of the ground, but also moved around.
Mariya, can you put the Zoom people on so that we can hear if they have any questions too? And while you do that, I will see who has the next question in the room, and then we can see if anyone is raising their hand. If I'm not seeing it and you are, let me know. Great, coming to you with the mic.
Kind of opposite Emily's question, I was interested in the geography evaluation, because when we think about extractive resources, they tend to increase in economic value as we move them around, especially thinking with uranium. Like the uranium benefited Moab, but it also benefited military industrial complexes for missile development and nuclear power, which are typically not in Southeast Utah. I was wondering if you could talk about why we're so focused on the local value in Moab and why we aren't associating more of the values and trying to reassess costs to the other places that benefited in this process.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And in a case study approach, I'm just kind of focused on the location where the materials are located and take me. And I think it is valuable to think about the history and legacy of uranium in Moab in relationship to in the relationship to its local context, because there aren't a lot of mining towns that have had this trajectory of recovery. And so it seems like a very exceptional story to me. And so I understand kind of the need to think more broadly in terms of the economics, but I also think there's a value to local specificities as well.
There's something kind of interesting, I think, there's that telecoupling of the impacts and the values, and then coupling that with the people who are coming to Moab from all over the world. These flows of different geographies are kind of intersecting there that are kind of interesting. It's a good question. I see that there's a question from Peter Howe online. Peter, can you ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me, Mariya?
Oh, yeah.
Very loudly.
Great. Okay, sorry. Thanks for that really interesting talk. I was wondering if you're seeing any evidence of a development of a new narrative around the development of renewable energy in the Moab area, or in similar desert locations, and if you see parallels to the uranium boom in the development of solar, for example.
So the parallels between the uranium boom and the development of other industries, is that kind of the question?
Yeah, like renewables, like solar in particular.
Okay. I definitely haven't looked into that, but I do think that there might be interesting parallels to think through there, because solar is it's not quite an extractive industry, but it's a land transforming industry, and so I like physical maybe parallels, but then maybe also narrative and discursive parallels. And then there's also always the question of limited land for development. And so kind of these tensions between what that land is used for is also interesting.
Thanks.
Other questions in the room? Comments, even thoughts it provoked for you? Great.
Did anyone that you interviewed in the community recognize the irony of wanting to like make a little park at a, Prospect Park and have, atomic grill, but also really not wanting the consequences of the mine in their community? Did that ever come up in any conversations?
No, and I mean, I think the irony is part of denaturalizing kind of some of those discourses, and so it comes out in the analysis.
At the beginning of your talk, with the portion about waste and value in the desert, I kept having images of the proving ground. Do you have any plans in the future to look at, kind of take the same lens and look at the proving ground? And I know that's a bit different because it is military and chemical waste, but just gauging your interest on that.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it. I've been thinking about desert wastes kind of more broadly. And so I've been thinking about fecal wastes in the desert, and also this kind of story of the monolith outside of Moab is this art piece that is declared as waste.
When you were looking at the site in Moab and talking to people in Moab, was there any connection, or did you look at all at the operations of potash ponds in that area?
No, and so I guess to clarify, I was looking at technical documents produced by folks working in Moab and interviewing folks in Thompson Springs to kind of get a sense of their relationship to the disposal cell. And I haven't looked at the potash ponds, and in all my time going down to Moab, I haven't driven down to the potash ponds, and so I intend to.
Other comments or questions in the room?
Sorry, I see a question in the chat from Wayne asking about whether I've uncovered anything about the range of names that were considered for the park. I haven't, not in the planning documents that I've looked at, and it would be interesting to see if there is an archive of those conversations, and yeah, or interview someone to understand kind of the logics behind that selection.
Any other thoughts that this is bringing to mind? Questions? Yeah, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about where it's neat to see research that's in kind of early phases and just unfolding and could go in a lot of different directions. Can you talk for a little bit about where you've mentioned a couple of things, but where would you like to take this research, either theoretically or methodologically, empirically in the area? Where do you think you're going with this?
That's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of abject waste and kind of how in geography we're really concerned with valuation as something that is kind of cyclical and unending. And so whether that's the extraction of economic value or kind of other ways of valuing that speak to emotional and kind of more localized senses of materials and places. And I've been thinking about abject waste as something that defies valuation, something that is so revolting that it cannot be reabsorbed into valuation. And so theoretically, I've been thinking about how kind of empirical case studies in geography can engage with the abject. And that's kind of why I was drawn to nuclear waste, because it is a waste that must be buried and can its relationship to the extractive process is so final, and also fecal waste because it's something that elicits disgust and revulsion. And so I am interested in how these materials can help us kind of shift our understanding of value from a geographic perspective.
That's interesting. I think of, you talked about fecal waste, but the conversion to biosolids and the use of the biosolids in various, repurposing is an example of where something so revolting actually is being turned into value. So
Yeah.
It's another case here where you think it's sort of going in one direction and then it comes around and surprises you as having other values we might not have considered, especially as technologies advance. Yeah, no, that'll all be very interesting. Other thoughts and comments from the room?
Out of curiosity, was there any opposition from the different communities that were considered for this waste, including Thompson Springs?
There is a lot of opposition from White Mesa and a lot of opposition from, I guess, the community of recreators who use Klondike Flats. And there wasn't a lot of engagement with Crescent Junction and Thompson Springs in the planning process. And some of that opposition happened after the fact, but it was kind of like a critical mass thing wherein the least people showed up to oppose because there are so few people there.
Anything else? Great. All right, well, let's give Dr. Shcheglovitova another round of applause for a nice talk. Very interesting and thought-provoking. And thank you. Oh, wait. Oh, no, they're clapping. I thought they were raising their hands. Sorry. Thanks for clapping, everybody. Okay, well, great. Well, thanks so much for coming today and have a good evening. And we'll see you at the next seminar. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.